Medieval winters were brutal. Freezing temperatures, no electricity, and no modern insulation. And yet, peasants didn't just survive, they adapted with brilliant techniques most of us have forgotten. From smoke-warmed homes to buried shelters, from layered wool to hot clay containers, their world was colder, but in some ways smarter. In this video, we uncovered 10 powerful methods medieval people used to stay warm, some practical, some unexpected, all rooted in resourcefulness. The cold was relentless, but so were they. 1. Smoke chambers and layered smoke heating. In many medieval homes, there were no chimneys, at least not the tall stone stacks we imagine today. Smoke didn't vanish upward through engineered flues. Instead, it lingered, thickening the air and blackening the walls. But while it might seem like poor design, this lingering smoke actually played a role in heating the home. These early homes functioned like smoke chambers. Fires were built in central hearths, and the smoke was left to rise and accumulate just below the ceiling. Without full ventilation, the warm air and warm smoke created a dense thermal layer that slowly filled the upper half of the room. It wasn't ideal for breathing, but it meant heat stayed inside rather than escaping straight out the roof. In single-room huts, families learned to live within the lower breathable zone, while the upper half of the room held the heat. Some homes had smoke lofts, platforms or beams near the roof where meat and fish were cured using the constant heat and smoke, keeping food dry and safe through winter. But even below that, the trapped warmth added a few precious degrees to the room, especially at night when the fire had burned down. Interestingly, this wasn't just tolerated, it was intentional. Fully ventilated fires lost heat too quickly, so homes were often built to leak just enough smoke without flushing out the warmth. Roof hatches or small vents were opened only when necessary. Some even stuffed cloth or straw around roof gaps to reduce airflow during cold nights. But the smoke did more than heat the room. It also acted as a natural disinfectant. The constant exposure helped repel insects, dry out moisture, and preserve wooden beams. In a world without insulation foam or chemical treatments, smoke gave the home a kind of low-tech resistance against rot, pests, and mold. There was even a security benefit. In isolated regions, where thieves or raiders were a concern, smoke from within a closed home revealed nothing. No firelight flickering through chimneys, no glow to attract attention. Today, thermal layering is still used in smoke lodges, saunas, survival shelters, and even energy-efficient architecture. But medieval peasants didn't have textbooks. They had experience, trial, and necessity. It wasn't glamorous. It made your clothes smell like smoke and soot-coated everything. But it worked. In the absence of chimney engineering, they chose the next best thing. Let the heat stay in, no matter what form it takes. Because in a medieval winter, breathing smoky air was better than freezing in clean silence. 2. Wool layering and body heat trapping. While fire warmed the room and smoke filled the ceiling with heat, medieval people knew that the most reliable warmth came from the body itself. And the key to keeping that warmth in? Wool. Lots of it. In layers. Linen may have touched the skin, but wool was the armor against the cold. It was thick, breathable, naturally insulating even when wet, and relatively easy to produce in most regions of Europe. Peasants didn't wear one heavy coat. They wore multiple layers, trapping thin pockets of warm air between each garment. This system turned the body into its own heat engine. What made this method so brilliant was its modularity. People could add or remove layers based on activity level and temperature. A laborer working in the field might remove the outer layer to avoid sweating, then put it back on during rest to avoid rapid cooling. This ability to thermoregulate through clothing was essential in harsh winters with no heating on the go. Outer garments were often made of coarse wool or felted cloth, both excellent at repelling wind and light moisture. Underneath, a softer wool tunic or vest retained heat closer to the body. In wealthier households, even undergarments and leggings were made with tightly woven wool blends. Hoods, gloves, and foot wraps completed the insulation system. Every extremity protected. But this wasn't just about material. The technique of dressing was part of the knowledge. Clothing was layered in specific ways, loose enough to trap air, tight enough to hold warmth, and arranged to allow airflow when needed. They understood intuitively what modern science now confirms. Air is the best insulator when trapped in small, stable layers. Wool also had a survival advantage beyond insulation. It was fire-resistant. In homes with open flames, this reduced the risk of injury. It was also naturally antimicrobial, which meant fewer infections, less odor, and less washing, ideal in winter when drying clothes was nearly impossible. And they didn't stop at clothing. Wool blankets, bedding, and wall hangings helped warm rooms. Tapestries weren't just decorative, they were functional insulation panels. Today, preppers and outdoor experts still swear by wool. In bushcraft circles, a single wool blanket can serve as a coat, sleeping bag, and fire-safe shield all in one. What medieval people practiced by necessity is now used by choice because it works. They didn't have high-tech fabrics, but with wool, layering, and instinct, they wore warmth like a second skin and survived the cold from the inside out. 3. By haywall insulation and stuffed gaps. When we picture medieval homes, we often think of stone walls and timber beams. But between those beams, especially in rural peasant cottages, the real insulation came from something far simpler: hay. Yes, the same straw used to feed animals and thatch roofs was also packed into the walls, crevices, and gaps of homes to stop wind and retain heat. Peasants stuffed loose hay or straw into every available opening, between wood planks, beneath thatched eaves, and even around door and window frames. It was a crude but highly effective form of insulation that turned drafty shelters into warm enclosures. It's worth noting that in medieval terminology, hay and straw had distinct uses. Hay, green, dried grass, was primarily feed, while straw, dried stalks from harvested grain, was the more common choice for insulation. It was less prone to rot, lighter, and didn't ferment like hay could when damp. This made it ideal for stuffing walls and packing into floors and ceilings. Walls made with wattle and daub, a woven lattice of wooden strips covered in clay and straw, relied heavily on straw as both a binder and an insulator. But beyond the structural role, extra layers of loose straw were often added inside wall cavities or behind simple hanging cloth to create thermal pockets, functioning similarly to modern insulation, trapping air to slow down heat loss. Straw was also used in seasonal or temporary shelters. During harvest season, workers who camped near the fields built small straw-insulated huts or lean-tos, reinforced with branches and cloth. In cold months, shepherds sometimes constructed low, semi-dug shelters using straw-packed walls and turf roofs, where body heat alone could maintain a survivable interior temperature. Even inside permanent homes, straw played a role beyond walls. It was packed under floorboards to block ground chill, stuffed between ceiling beams for insulation, and sewn into large draft stoppers placed at door thresholds or windowsills. Surprisingly, it also added a degree of sound insulation. In crowded homes, where families lived in a single room, reducing echoes and noise made daily life slightly more comfortable, and warmer too. The hushed quiet of a straw-packed wall helped create a more peaceful space to rest, eat, and wait out winter. Of course, straw had its downsides. It was flammable, attracted mice, and needed frequent replacement. But, for the medieval peasant, it was abundant, accessible, and most importantly, effective. Straw wasn't elegant, but it was ingenious. When woven into walls and floors, it turned simple huts into survival capsules and made winter something that could be endured, one stuffed gap at a time. 4. Sleeping in groups, heat circles. In modern homes, we take privacy for granted. Each person might have their own room, bed, and sometimes even a thermostat. But for medieval peasants, warmth came before privacy, and that meant sleeping together, literally. When temperatures dropped, entire families, parents, children, and sometimes even livestock slept side by side, wrapped in shared blankets or under layers of wool and straw. This wasn't just for comfort, It was a deliberate survival tactic based on body heat conservation. In cramped single-room homes, beds were scarce. Hay mattresses or simple raised platforms were often the only sleeping surface. To retain heat, everyone slept close together in what survivalists today would call a heat circle, a formation where each body traps and shares warmth with the next. The more people, the more cumulative heat was retained under the covers or inside the enclosed sleeping area. This technique was especially vital for young children and the elderly, who were more vulnerable to the cold. In many homes, the children were placed in the center of the group, where the warmth from surrounding bodies kept their core temperature stable through the night. In the harshest climates or poorest conditions, even animals joined in. Dogs, goats, and occasionally smaller livestock would sleep indoors or at the edge of the human circle. Their body heat was valuable, and their presence offered an extra layer of thermal mass, a natural, living heater at your feet. To maximize the effect, families often used thick curtains or canopies to trap heat around the sleeping area. Canopy beds were common not just among nobles, but also in more humble versions within peasant homes, where heavy fabrics or even hanging sacks of straw created a warm bubble around the bed. Some homes also had built-in sleeping nooks, semi-enclosed compartments carved into walls or lofts, which limited airflow and trapped warmth efficiently. These little pockets of shelter created an intimate microclimate, a room within a room, where a few degrees of heat made all the difference. The idea was simple. Warmth is multiplied through connection. In a time before central heating, the human body was one of the most reliable sources of energy available. Sharing that warmth wasn't just common sense, it was culture. It was family. And while today we might see that closeness as inconvenient, to the medieval peasant, it was just another night. Cold outside, but inside, pressed close, the warmth was enough. 5 clay pot heaters and hot containers. When open fires weren't an option, either because of danger, lack of space, or the need to move around, medieval peasants turned to contained heat, and one of the most clever tools in their arsenal was the use of clay pots filled with embers or hot stones. These clay vessels worked like primitive space heaters. After heating stones in the hearth or collecting glowing coals, peasants placed them into small, thick-walled clay pots. The radiant heat would warm the surrounding air gradually and safely, especially in tight spaces like sleeping areas, cellars, or even under tables. Unlike open flames, these pots could be managed with minimal smoke or fire risk, perfect for enclosed homes with poor ventilation. They also had long thermal retention, thanks to the properties of baked clay and stone. Once heated, they could radiate gentle warmth for hours, especially when wrapped in wool or cloth to control the output. A variation of this method included placing the pot inside a wooden box, sometimes lined with straw or wool, turning it into a medieval version of a heat pack. In cold rooms, these boxes would be tucked under benches, at the foot of beds, or even beneath cloaks to create personal heat zones without constant fuel consumption. This technique also gave rise to a type of clay bed warmer, used similarly to metal warming pans. Instead of filling a copper pan with embers and sliding it between the sheets, peasants in poorer households might use a small ceramic bowl of embers, placed safely on a flat tile near the bed. With care and positioning, it could gently warm the air and bedding without direct contact. These containers also served a dual purpose. During the day, they could be used for cooking or carrying warm water. At night, they became passive heat sources. In winter markets, similar portable warmers were used by vendors and craftspeople to keep their hands warm while working outdoors. There's even evidence that clay pots were used inside cloaks, held close to the body or placed near the feet to generate warmth during travel or cold gatherings. Wrapped in thick cloth or stored inside leather pouches, they acted like medieval hot water bottles, but without the water. This method didn't require wealth or complexity, just fire, stone, clay, and a little care. It was scalable, repeatable, and could be passed from person to person like a personal heater. Modern survivalists and off-grid homesteaders have rediscovered similar techniques using terracotta pots, candles, and thermal mass. But medieval peasants were doing it long before it had a name, because necessity taught them how to turn a pot of coals into comfort. 6. Dugout shelters and semi-buried homes. When the air outside was bitter cold and firewood was scarce, some medieval peasants turned to the oldest form of insulation known to humanity, the earth itself. By building shelters that were partially or fully dug into the ground, they created homes where nature did most of the heating. These dugouts or semi-buried homes took advantage of the Earth's stable underground temperature, which stays well above freezing even in the depths of winter. By constructing homes where the floor sat below ground level, or sometimes where only the roof rose above it, peasants could reduce heat loss and eliminate exposure to cold winds. This technique wasn't new to the medieval period, but it was perfected through experience. In colder regions of Eastern and Northern Europe, entire communities built sunken cottages lined with logs, clay, or stone, and covered with turf or straw. The thick earthen walls and roofs held heat remarkably well, turning a few hours of fire into an entire night of comfort. Inside, the layout was simple: a single room with a low ceiling, a central hearth, and minimal windows. The smaller the space, the easier it was to keep warm. Smoke from the fire helped insulate the roof, as we saw in earlier topics, and walls were often lined with packed straw or cloth to prevent moisture and draft. Some shelters were purely seasonal, used by shepherds, field workers, or travelers who needed refuge in harsh conditions. Others were permanent, often indistinguishable from the land itself. With turf roofs and dirt walls, they blended into hillsides, which not only preserved warmth but offered stealth during times of war or unrest. Dugouts weren't just practical, they were strategically brilliant. They required fewer materials, could be constructed in remote or forested areas, and often remained warmer than above-ground houses during the coldest nights. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavia to the Balkans shows that this technique was used across cultures and centuries. Today, modern earth homes and off-grid structures mimic the same principles: thermal mass, wind protection, and passive insulation. In fact, the very logic behind energy-efficient underground homes comes directly from these medieval solutions. To a modern eye, these shelters might look like poverty, but to those who built them, they were a shield, a womb of warmth carved into the frozen earth. When the world outside froze, the smartest peasants didn't fight nature. They dug into it and let it protect them. 7 Winter cloaks as personal heat chambers. In the Middle Ages, a cloak wasn't just something you threw over your shoulders. It was a thermal survival tool, engineered through centuries of necessity to turn the human body into its own heat source and keep that heat trapped as long as possible. Made primarily of thick wool, often layered or felted for extra density, winter cloaks were cut in a semicircular shape, designed to wrap around the entire body and create a seal against the wind. They weren't tightly fitted like coats today. They were wide, heavy, and flowed down past the knees or even to the ankles. That loose shape wasn't just for style. It created a dome of warm air, much like a tent around the body. When pulled tight and fastened at the neck or shoulder, a cloak functioned as a personal heat chamber. The body's natural warmth, insulated by the heavy fabric, could be held close to the skin for hours. Combined with layered tunics underneath, a single cloak could keep someone warm even in sleet, snow, or frigid wind. But the genius of cloaks didn't stop at insulation. They were also multi-purpose survival gear. Peasants used them as blankets during travel or in unheated homes, sleeping covers at night, especially in shared beds or floor spaces, windbreaks when working outdoors, and even improvised tents in the field, thrown over branches or poles for shelter. In some regions, cloaks were lined with fur or additional wool padding, making them even more effective. Others were coated with lanolin, natural sheep oil, or wax to add water resistance. And since most were made locally from village-spun wool, peasants could tailor them to regional climates and needs. Even head coverage was built into the design. Many cloaks included attached hoods or cowls, which were pulled low over the face and tied or pinned at the side. This provided protection for the neck, ears, and head, critical zones for heat loss. What makes this technique so powerful is that it didn't rely on fire, shelter, or others. A peasant could stay warm on the move, in isolation, or during outdoor labor. They carried their heat source with them. Modern bushcrafters, reenactors, and survivalists still use wool cloaks or ponchos today, not for fashion but for function, because few garments do more with less. The medieval cloak wasn't an accessory. It was armor against the cold. A shelter you wore? And in the depths of winter, it could mean the difference between frostbite and another day alive. 8. Heat-storing furniture, stone benches, warm seats. When you picture medieval furniture, you probably think of rough wood, creaky chairs, and maybe a hay-stuffed bench. But in many parts of Europe, especially colder regions, peasants and craftsmen developed heat-retaining furniture designed to absorb and radiate warmth throughout the day. One of the simplest and most effective examples? Stone or masonry benches built directly into the walls near the hearth. These were more than just seats. They were part of the home's heating strategy. Positioned beside or even connected to the central fireplace, these stone benches absorbed radiant heat throughout the day. Once the fire died down, they continued to emit gentle warmth for hours, turning the seating area into a kind of cozy hot spot where people could eat, sew, sharpen tools, or rest. In some homes, these heat-retaining surfaces extended beyond benches. Raised platforms or beds were built over heated masonry, an early cousin of the hypocaust system used by the Romans. Though peasants didn't have access to that level of engineering, the concept was clear. Mass holds heat. The thicker and denser the material, the longer it stays warm. Wooden furniture also adapted to this logic. Some homes featured hollowed wooden benches or boxes that could hold heated stones or small pots of embers inside, carefully managed to avoid fire risk. These warm seats were placed near windows or outer walls where cold drafts were most common. Even folding stools and hand-warming tables, small wooden structures with compartments for hot coals, were used in slightly more prosperous households. While commoners may not have owned them, they often improvised similar methods, using clay pots or stones beneath benches. The genius here is in the layering. Furniture wasn't just functional, it was thermal. Seating, bedding, even workbenches became low-tech radiators, drawing from the same fire and holding on to its warmth long after the last ember faded. Today, thermal mass remains a key principle in passive heating architecture. Homes that incorporate stone floors, clay walls, or tile-covered stoves are simply modern versions of what medieval peasants figured out by trial and necessity. In an age where every resource mattered, even a place to sit was designed with survival in mind. Because when you can turn your bench into a battery for heat, you don't just rest, you recharge. 9. Outdoor windbreaks and sun traps. Not all medieval heating happened indoors. In fact, peasants understood that controlling the environment around the home was just as important as managing what happened inside. With no insulation foam or modern engineering, they relied on two powerful tools: windbreaks and sun traps. A windbreak was any structure, natural or man-made, designed to block or redirect cold winds. In open fields, peasants planted thick hedgerows, dense bushes, or rows of trees on the windward side of their homes to absorb and deflect icy gusts. Over time, these barriers reduced wind chill dramatically, making the immediate area around a home feel significantly warmer. Where natural growth wasn't available, they used fences, woven wattle panels, or even stacks of firewood to act as protective walls. These weren't just for privacy or livestock, they were thermal defense systems, placed strategically to break the wind before it hit the home's walls or doors. The result? Less heat loss, fewer drafts, and more comfort inside, with the same amount of fuel. But peasants didn't just protect from the wind, they also knew how to trap the sun. Many medieval homes, especially in colder regions, were built or oriented facing south, where sunlight could enter through windows or doors during the day. On cold but clear days, doors and shutters were opened briefly to allow sunlight to warm the interior stone or clay surfaces, which would radiate heat slowly throughout the night. Some villages even built outdoor work areas in sun-facing corners, shielded from wind and enclosed by stone or thatch. These solar pockets became warm spots for cooking, mending tools, or preparing food without needing to burn extra firewood indoors. In a way, this was passive solar heating centuries before the term existed. By reading the land, noting the sun's path, and placing key structures in the right place, peasants could extend the reach of every sunbeam, especially in the short days of winter. These techniques weren't loud or high-tech. They were quiet, consistent, and deeply effective. Modern green architecture still uses the same ideas: windbreak landscaping, passive solar exposure, thermal mass. But the peasants didn't have blueprints. They had instinct. When the cold came, they didn't just huddle inside. They shaped the world around them to hold on to the light. 10. Ash beds and residual heat from hearths. In a medieval winter, every ember counted. And once the fire had burned down, what remained wasn't trash, it was opportunity. Peasants knew that ashes from the hearth still held warmth long after the flames were gone, and they learned how to use that residual heat to their advantage in the simplest, most physical way possible: ash beds. Before going to sleep, some families would spread hot ashes beneath straw-filled mattresses or directly onto the packed earth where they planned to rest. A layer of cloth or animal hide was placed on top to prevent direct contact, and the retained heat from the ashes provided a gentle warmth from below, like a primitive version of a heated mattress pad. This method didn't last all night, but for the first few hours of bitter cold, it made a significant difference. It kept the dampness out of the bedding, warmed the body from below, where heat is usually lost, and made falling asleep in a freezing room a little more bearable. Ash wasn't just warm, it was also dry and insulating. In some households, ashes were used to create temporary insulation along the base of walls or even under the hearth itself. The porous structure of ash made it a lightweight buffer that slowed heat loss and absorbed residual warmth from coals or stones. Another trick involved banking the fire, that is, covering live coals with a thick layer of ash at night. This smothered the flame, but kept the core heat alive until morning. In the early hours, someone would stir the hearth, uncover the coals, and reignite the fire without starting from scratch. It was the medieval version of sleep mode for fire: less smoke, less wood, and less effort. Ashes were also used as a base layer in foot warmers and clay pots, helping to hold in heat and prevent burns when embers were stored in containers. They acted as a cushion between the hot material and the surrounding structure, extending the safe usability of these tools. Beyond heat, ash served dozens of other purposes: cleaning agent, fertilizer, even wound treatment, but its role in heating, as both insulator and thermal battery, was a quiet triumph of resourcefulness. Nothing was wasted, not even the gray dust of yesterday's fire. Because when you have almost nothing, you learn that warmth can live in the ashes if you know how to hold on to it. The wisdom buried in the cold. Modern heating is loud, expensive, and invisible, but medieval heating? It was intimate. It was earned. There were no buttons to press, no thermostats to adjust, just bodies, stones, smoke, and instinct, woven together in 1,000 small acts of survival. What looked like poverty from the outside was, in reality, a deep conversation with nature. How to use what the earth gives you, and nothing more. They stuffed walls with straw. They turned fire's leftovers into fuel. They wore their shelter on their backs. And somehow, with no insulation, no electricity, no convenience, they made it through. Today, we depend on systems we barely understand, but they depended on their hands, their homes, and each other. And in the face of the same brutal cold, they found warmth not just in heat, but in creativity, connection, and care. So maybe the question isn't, how did they survive the winter? The real question is, could we?